On the line with us, Professor Dan Sisson, author of The American Revolution of 1800, distinguished professor of American history and the revolution coming our way here at the Thom Hartmann University on the banks of the Potomac, adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches the history of technology in the engineering department. And this is our book club. We're up to chapter 7 now in The American Revolution of 1800. And Dan, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Or Professor Sisson, I should say. Glad to have you with us. So in Chapter 7, first of all, the essence of Chapter 7. You want to summarize it?
Well, I would say that it's a statement about the expectations of what's going to happen in 1800. This is in the spring of 1800, and Hamilton is writing a letter to some of his colleagues there who are members of the administration, and he's telling them that we had better start to shape up here. We're looking around at all these factions that are speaking out against the administration, and they're going to lead to violence because the Virginians are in the lead here, and the Virginians are going to try to do some things by peaceful means, but if they can't succeed, they're going to turn to physical force. These are his words.
The Virginians being Jefferson, Madison.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. The Virginians were the most populous state at the time.
Right.
And that's where the Alien and Sedition Acts come from. I mean, the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so this was the dialectic that was taking place in our country. And really what the essence of the chapter is that we need to pay attention, not only in the 1800, but in our own time, to what I see as a two-city thesis of revolution that's emerging. And we should be able to recognize the characteristics of this oncoming revolution. And so this is what Jefferson and Madison were doing. And they were looking around at the economic implications. And they were seeing that the banking system and the finance system was mirroring what was taking place in England, that there were mercantile classes ranged against the interest of the agricultural classes. If you look at the ideological characteristics of revolution, you see that we had increasingly all of this emphasis upon quasi-monarchical factions and ceremonies in the Adams administration. People were talking about the sympathy with the monarchy. We were talking about going to war with France. You know, I mean, in other words, some
serious stuff. The thing that I find most interesting about about Chapter 7 is the way that you basically suggest implicitly or explicitly that this moment in time right now, you know, the fall of 2014, or actually, you know, a year or so ago or 40 years ago when you were writing the book. I mean, this modern moment in time is a revolutionary moment, as 1800 was a revolutionary moment. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think you're right on. It's not only implicit, but it's also explicit in the sense that if you look at today, we have a financial crisis that is unprecedented in perhaps a century. We don't know what to do to get our economy going again. We see all of the manipulation by Wall Street in terms of money being given to bail them out. And we have another bill that just passed this last week, which is going to guarantee that again. We're talking about the increase of the military and its influence in our society. We're talking about a crisis about spying and information, whether the government's going to be able to penetrate everybody's telephone and use that against you. I mean, these are issues that boil down to a kind of institutional and constitutional crisis in our society. It takes a long time for Americans to be able to see this coming together. And if we look at 1800, even 1798, 99, 1800, what we see is that the people who had the most insight, like Jefferson and Madison, they realized what was taking place. And they were determined that they were going to do something about it. And so what we see in America today in 2014, more and more people are speaking out saying, we're going to do something about these conditions. And so we're starting to see organizations form everywhere. I don't care what part of society you look at. I would even say so much that the right wing, that is the Republicans, are using the forms of Jefferson better than the Democrats are at the national level and the state level. They've gone into state legislatures at this point. They're going into school boards. They're writing curriculum. I mean, in other words, they're seeping down deep into the interstices of America at every level.
Right.
And the Democrats had better sort of look out and realize what's going on.
Yeah. You described the conservative crisis of mid-1800, of that year, and this was the year that, in November of that year, that Thomas Jefferson became president, or at the end of that year. What was the conservative crisis?
Well, the conservative crisis was the fact that the institutions were paralyzed. If somebody who reads the book will see that Alexander Hamilton had penetrated the Adams administration. He had control of the Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, Secretary of War McHenry. He was Secretary of State Pickering. Every time that Adams would hold a cabinet meeting, these guys would argue against him, and they were unanimous. And when he called for a vote, Adams was outvoted on every single question. Can you imagine a president of the United States being confronted with something like this, especially
in his own cabinet?
That's right. I mean, it was insidious, and nobody said anything to Adams about this.
Now, these were not Jeffersonians who were revolting against Adams. These were Hamiltonians?
That's right. Hamilton had produced a crisis within his own party, become a faction.
So you had a hard right, essentially in modern parlance, a Federalist president, John Adams,
right,
who was turning America into this kind of monarchical. You know, when his carriage went through town, they had to do a 21-gun salute and shout, "God bless," God save President Adams, and all this kind of stuff. He was starting to act like a king, and he was challenged not from the left, not from the Jefferson-Madison faction, but from the right within his own cabinet.
Absolutely. And this is one of the novel characteristics of the entire book, is that I believe that John Adams went along with this, believing that his administration was with him, when in fact they were undermining his very authority. Hamilton was endorsing a man by the name of Charles Pinckney as the next president, and he had been praising Jefferson along with everybody else Adams for 3 years, saying what a great man and patriot Adams was, a great revolutionary hero. And all of a sudden he turns on Adams, writes a pamphlet describing Adams' behavior, and Adams suddenly begins to see that the things that Jefferson is saying and Madison are saying with their resolutions are true. And so within the conservative administration, there is this huge confrontation. Adams actually has to go to Braintree and stay there for months at a time.
His home.
So his home,
Braintree,
right?
Mass.
So he can't sign any legislation that becomes law. He realizes at this point that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a big mistake, and they produced a constitutional crisis. I think this is a moment in Adams's mind in which he's undergoing a conversion, and he's realizing what's at stake here. Right. And these three things that I mentioned about the institutional and ideological crises, I mean, this is something that Adams had to come to face. And
so Adams, you think, in that moment realized that he'd gone too far?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he realizes he's got to change.
Remarkable. Dan Sisson, the book is The American Revolution of 1800. It's available in bookstores all across the country. We're talking Chapter 7 here. It's our Thom Hartmann Book Club in Thom Hartmann University. Dan Sisson, the author of The American Revolution of 1800. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
The book is The American Revolution of 1800. The author, Dan Sisson. Dan, welcome back. You described an attempt at a coup d'etat by Federalists in Pennsylvania and New York, and you were just talking about the serious irregularities in the office of the president. Can you describe some of these incidents? And I don't think most Americans know about this.
I don't think so either. And what I discovered was that in Pennsylvania, for example, there was something called the Ross Bill. James Ross was a senator from Pennsylvania, and he figured out a way to try and appoint a committee of 13 members of Congress and the U.S. Senate that would determine the electors that would make the decision about who was going to be president in the election of 1800. And what they were going to do was to simply leapfrog and take that decision away from the people of the United States and put it into the hands of basically 7 members of the Senate, which was controlled by the Federalists at that time. And so they were telling all of the lawyers and the counselors to the president and others that they had no business to question the jurisdiction of the Senate on this. And when this became public, it was actually made into a bill. Madison and Jefferson both had an incredibly severe reaction. Madison, remember, he's the father of our Constitution. He's the one who said, if they continue to do this, he said, we're going to have to establish something to demand our rights. He says, this is a question of our rights being taken away from us and revolution. And Jefferson, this is sort of like approval of Jefferson's stirring up the public with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, questioning the constitutionality of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so what we have here is a severe constitutional crisis. And more than that is Hamilton then goes to New York, and when he finds out that Burr has won the election, he says to the governor of New York, John Jay, we've got to change the way that we count the electoral votes here, and we've got to do something about this. Otherwise, the Jefferson will be in a position where Jefferson will win the election of 1800. Got to give John Jay credit. John Jay writes on the margins of the letter that Hamilton wrote to him, this is for party purposes, which is not worthy of my consideration. And so
John Jay, who wasn't he the first Supreme Court justice?
He was the first Chief Justice.
Chief Justice, yeah.
Yeah, and he was a very honorable man. And what he's making a judgment about here is the role of party becoming faction.
Right.
And so, and when we look at this today and we see that, the CIA is a faction unto itself, it's like an establishment that is so powerful that hardly anyone can come up against this. And this is really serious. I think that if we can take a step back and we can sort of look at the major organizations in our society in 2014 as representatives of parties, but becoming factions for their special interests, we can get a clearer picture of what they're doing. And what we're seeing is the creation of a constitutional crisis, just like in 1800. I don't see any difference between this, this kind of crisis that we're facing and what was going on at the time with Jefferson and Adams.
Remarkable. We'll be right back with Dan Sisson, the book, The American Revolution of 1800. 20 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Minutes past the hour. Welcome back. We're talking with Dan Sisson, professor of American history here at the distinguished professor of American history at the Thom Hartmann University and an adjunct faculty member at Eastern Washington University, where he teaches the history of technology in the engineering department. And he is the author of the book, The American Revolution of 1800, about the election that Thomas Jefferson ultimately won that really was a revolutionary moment in American history, and the parallels between that revolutionary moment and right now. And we're up to Chapter 7, where this is our book club here at Thom Hartmann University. We're going through the book club. And at the end of Chapter 7, Dan, you describe how President Adams destroyed the unity of his own Federalist Party, in part because it had become a faction. And you've touched on this, earlier in our conversation, but just to kind of wrap this whole thing, when there was this conclusion that parties, in this case the Federalists, had become a faction being a group of people whose own self-interest is actually opposed to the interests of the nation.
That's right.
That the political party had become opposed to the interest of the nation. And then you suggested just a minute ago that in a very similar way, it's not a political party, but it's an institution within government. Our national security apparatus or our military have become factions. What do you mean?
Well, what I'm saying is that these organizations are acting in their own self-interest, skewing the budgets, setting our priorities, and they are producing a constitutional crisis. There is no question if those people who have rallied to support torture are able to get away with this. I mean, in other words, they're not going to be ever punished, or they're going to continue someday to be able to continue the policies, then we have literally had a constitutional crisis in which we've lost the essence of our constitutional values. We believe in human dignity. The Eighth Amendment to the Constitution says that we shall not engage in torture. And here we are. We have these people like John Brennan and others who are defending their actions. Right. And we have a president, and this is why I wanted to talk about John Adams, because the difference between, say, a president like John Adams, who realizes that there is a constitutional crisis, and a president like, say, Mr. Obama, who was confronted with a constitutional crisis, it should be compared. When Adams was in this situation, the first thing that he did was he dismissed his Secretary of State Pickering, and he dismissed his Secretary of State War, McHenry, and he said, these people are not going to be able to make any decisions in my administration. Then he said that he was going to prevent Hamilton from being named the commander-in-chief of the armies. And then he said that if anybody does become commander-in-chief, they're going to have to rotate every year so that no one person can amass power within an administration. Right. And then he decided that he was going to start to criticize Hamilton, who had already written a pamphlet opposing him and criticizing him. And so he starts to say that his administration was filled with all kinds of people who were members of an oligarchic faction. They were the High Federalists, and they were undermining the American Revolution. And all of a sudden, it seems that Adams decided that everything that he had fought for as a young man in the Revolution was at stake, and he starts praising Jefferson. And all of a sudden, all the Federalists who are just beginning to realize what's going on are saying, we've got the president saying the very things that the Republicans are saying, the Democrats, and against Mr. Hamilton and all of his supporters. And so he produced this major crisis of doubt and uncertainty and paralysis with his own party.
And yet, in 1800, you had political figures like Thomas Jefferson and ultimately John Adams, who were willing to stand up to faction in their own cabinet, in their own government. And now we have a president who seems to be unwilling to stand up to the national security apparatus. And I mean, he campaigned on cleaning this mess up. And I frankly think it's so out of control that even the president can't do anything about it.
This is what we're beginning to conclude. And when he can get rid of Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel, who is a voice of moderation, and then he embraces Brennan and some of the more contemporary figures, we have to really wonder whether or not we have a president who can face a constitutional crisis. And there's enormous amount at stake here. I mean, the very future of American principles and ideals. I mean, the whole book about 1800, the Revolution of 1800, is Thomas Jefferson and Madison. All he's talking about the principles of a free society. Right. We've got to maintain these things. And we're not doing it when we say that we can torture other human beings, no matter whether it's in the United States or in some foreign country. I mean, that's just unacceptable. Yeah. So we're at a turning point, I think. And Adams is the kind of president that we would look up to, who would say that I'm going to preserve these values, even if it means that my party is going to lose. That's what he was saying.
Looking back on the last century and fragment, going back to 1900, it seems to me that the two times in American history when we have confronted such a crisis in a big way were, Teddy Roosevelt's presidency and during Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. arguably the end of the Nixon presidency. I'm curious if you see any parallels to this moment in time in our lifetime or in the century that we were born, or is this a more unprecedented time? Is this more like 1800 right now?
Well,
we have 1 minute, Dan.
Yeah, I would say that these crises recur throughout our history. You can look at Teddy Roosevelt and his trust busting and how he brought some of the major economic powers under control. You can look at Franklin Roosevelt, in terms of preserving the dignity of, say, senior citizens and people in his administration, and trying to give them some way to survive, and restoring the economy. But when you look at the individuals who are acting as members of factions and doing things that would undermine our institutions, that's what I mean. Alexander Hamilton is on record as saying to other people, get the secret diaries of John Adams and give them to me, and I'll use them in the pamphlet attacking the president.
Wow.
So, it's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, a guy inside, it's amazing.
Stealing information that's private, personal diaries of the President of the United States to use against him.
Yeah, Alexander Hamilton had a lot to answer for. Dan Sisson, the book is The American Revolution of 1800. Hang on.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-536-2370.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for writing this book. Thanks for dropping by today.
Okay, Tom.
We'll see you next week. We'll be back.